Welcome to the Data Product Management in Action podcast, created and executive produced by me, Scott Hirleman, and brought to you by Soda, your best friend in data quality and contracts tooling. We created this podcast to serve as a place for actual practitioners bringing product management practices to data, whether that is to AI and ML, data products, platforms, or everything else in data, right? And it's to dig into the nitty-gritty of product management in data, but in fun and dynamic conversations. It's not just lift and shift from software product management. We have a great set of hosts for you that are also practitioners, so they can really get into those specifics and dive deep and get you the information you want to know rather than just high level, here is what a data product is. This is about cutting through the noise of data product management to drive towards actionable insights, hence the actual podcast name, Data Product Management in Action. So sit back and enjoy another awesome conversation.
Hey everyone, I'm Michael Toland, one of your hosts for the Data Product Management in Action, sponsored by Soda and a spinoff of the Data as a Product podcast network. You probably know that network through the Data Mesh Radio through Scott Hirleman. And as always, today, guests are representing their own views and do not represent the views of their employers. Today, I am talking with Andrew Warner, a senior product manager at Genome Medical over platform and integrations. And we're going to be talking about a really fascinating topic that I have struggled with, which is the monetizing and marketing of data, particularly in healthcare data. Andrew and I have both some experience, Andrew a lot more than I, in building out platforms for healthcare data specifically. But Andrew, welcome to the Data Product Management in Action podcast. How's your day going?
Good. Thanks, Michael. I'm so excited to be here, and it's going well. It's going to be another scorcher here in Ohio, so I'm going to try to stay in the basement.
Yeah, Andrew and I are both suffering through the Midwest and New England heat wave, everyone. So it's been thrilling. That said, Andrew, outside of just, you're a senior product manager at Genome Medical, what other sort of attributes or places and experience, has gotten you here to really be a data product manager specific?
Yeah, so I guess really it dials all the way back to like working at Ohio State. So I worked at Ohio State University. Decent amount of time, I was in the mobile app a little world there, but really got into the financials, data, moving money, really common. I think that was really sparked it, was just understanding, how does money move throughout the business? How does everything work, right? Like how do we make the whole thing work? And then moved into healthcare. My wife is a nurse, so I've been really deep in this health world. Now I've dove into it for the past 6 years, and it just continues to be into this confusing space of understanding what is a patient, what does the information mean, how does it travel through the healthcare system, and it's right. So really just trying to get to this point of how do we make it clear and usable for people around the world.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And in our prior conversations, we had talked around what is it to be usable specifically from the consumer side of that equation, right? And so I know we had talked about some market research around who your customers are and identifying, and wondering if you can go a little bit deeper for our audience to really talk through what research is required when you're looking at trying to monetize and sell your data to even determine if it's worth anything.
Yeah, I say the biggest piece with just trying to identify who it is, I guess it really just, you back it up 6 steps, right? Into just how you identify any market for a product. Just go, who could actually use this information? Just starting with bare bones base information and, in the genetics space now. So who can use the genetics information for the population? So let's start with something to drug development as a good example here, right? Drug development is big. The biggest problem in any drug development is just having people to run through clinical trials. Number one, right? So there's plenty of clinical research organizations that exist out there that they do, right? So they do all this recruitment. It's a high dollar thing for people to get into. And I guess the biggest piece with that is how do you pull away that recruitment effort? Because recruiting just in general my past life I did recruiting, is an expensive task for somebody to do. You're talking to hundreds of people, thousands of people, trying to get them, interested in this one little piece, right? And those recruitment organizations really are just hired guns, just like you would hire a firm to come in and do it. So there's really so I think that's like first is just identifying who you could sell it to, number one, right? So in our case, research organizations, you could go into insurance companies if you're trying to sell just pop health data. I worked in remote patient monitoring before, and what we collected there was a lot of what are people doing on the daily basis with their nutrition, all of this, base information to say, you could sell this to insurance companies. You could sell it to Kroger as a good example, right? Of like whatever health conscious people or people who are trying to move down this path for, you could sell it to drug development companies, for these GLP-1 drugs that are existing out there. So it just, there's tons of different avenues you can go, but it all really gets into the data quality too, of where your data. So,
oh boy, yeah, data quality is another big piece in here. But I really, from what I gather though, is like you need to understand who's interested in the data, and I think you're really wise to go after the recruiters for these clinical trials first, because they are spending so much time of like sifting through or working with these different repositories of patient data, particularly these hospital systems, try to identify and target this person has this kind of marker. These are the criteria of patients that we want. But I really like how you're then expanding that to like what other types of demographics about patients might be relevant to other companies. Like the Kroger one is one I didn't even think about. But like if you think about market nutrition and how, the nutrition data that so many hospital systems have, like I didn't even think of this, but like all of your biometrics around cholesterol and stuff are indicators of your data, of your nutrition. And then there's going to be like these free-form doctor notes and stuff that are entered into your chart that probably is really compelling information for a lot of market. Well, you just opened up a world for me. My head is exploding. And I guess to expand on that then, from a patient data perspective, obviously there are a lot of criteria when you're running these sort of trials from the pharmaceutical side for these drug trials of they want to target specific things, and they get pretty granular. They'll be like, I want someone with like this genomic sequence. I want someone who has this blood type. I want someone with like all of these very specific conditions. And have you found a good way of like parsing through and sorting through patient data to provide like this universe of what they're requesting? I'm curious in that.
Yeah. So I'd say that's the biggest piece here where I'm currently at is we have all this information, but it's just spread throughout everything. So it's that tying back of whose information is what. So here, I guess I keep saying I guess, but I know, right? Because this is just the path that I'm going down and working through currently. What we've done is we listen to these clinical research organizations, just understand, to your point, all right, these genetic markers, these certain proteins, these familial histories, another, right? So we have all this, some free-form text, some is very organized and straightforward, just like the genetics data. So really, we create these, I would say dashboards for a lack of a better word, but we use these search tools to kind of work directly with these research organizations just to go, all right, what are you looking for? In just listening and hearing them, almost approaching them like the recruiter would, saying, what's the information that you're looking for? And then pulling it out into, we've used some AI tools, some generative AI tools to look through our data sets of just saying, what do we have, right? Do we have any information for this? And just typing in basic queries of, give me this protein. How many patients? Who are the perfect? Because it's not organized currently. And that's the path that we're moving down, is just to understand how we need to organize this so that we can move our stuff into, so that it's organized in a proper way. And then you move into different products that you can sell with it. But so we're just using basic tools right now. And it's a lot of manual effort into sometimes a spreadsheet, sometimes a database query, sometimes some of the Gemini products to go through and pull out that information. And we're still in that infancy phase of just understanding how and what is big.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by the promise, and maybe some of the lofty expectations we're thrusting at currently these large language models to provide us a way to really manage how much unstructured data there is in the world. I actually think that that's one of the key differentiators of what AI can do, to where we may not need to structure our data as neatly and cleanly as we thought we did in order to get insights and gain access to it. I don't have a lot of experience working with it yet, but I will say the ability to just ask a question around the context of my data and metadata, ask questions around the actual raw data, and then help, because I'm terrible at SQL. Key secret here, a lot of product managers are not great at SQL, folks. But I will say it has improved because of these generative AI tools. And I think one of the things that continuously hear pop up, particularly around AI and healthcare data, is we might be able to get to this promise of longitudinal patient studies, assuming we can tie all of these records from disparate entities together. And I want to talk about that first before we go into the longitudinal patient study. But you're getting data from EHRs, you're getting data from pharmacies, you're getting data from these small private practices versus these big healthcare systems. You're sometimes getting data from like tangential sources about these potential patients. And so like, how do we tie all that together? Because it's coming from disparate systems that have no common data model a lot of times. I know a lot of people are trying to move to this FHIR data model, but we're not there yet. And I'm really curious, like how have you found tactically abilities to start bringing that data together?
Yeah, the FHIR data model in its own right too is this giant misnomer that it's organized all the time. Yeah, right? Like it is, but it isn't. But
yeah,
so the beauty in healthcare data in the patients themselves, they do have specific markers of who they are and certain attributes, whether it be a social security number or some of these different, like very specific data points for people. Now, if you're ever trying to get into this world and trying to match a patient record with the one that exists, now that can be a pain because you have your given name, you have your preferred name, Andy is a preferred name of mine, back to my childhood. So if I sign up for something with Andy Warner, it may not show up when I put in a record for Andrew Warner. So you have to first work through this algorithm, and we've done a pretty good job of doing this to say, outside of just social security, right? Which is a great key to have if you have it.
Yeah.
But there are, say like, there's a LexisNexis product out there using some of these credit institutions or pulling some of this other data to say, all right, I'm going to give you this patient name, first name, last name, date of birth, here's an address. Give me, is this the same as something that already exists in my system today? So there are these different services that do exist out here to help you tie the person to the record. And then, which is really, really nice to have, these credit institutions, which, fit into so many different pieces of our lives, right? From being able to get a loan to just signing up for something. So it's using those tools to kind of help facilitate that handshake agreement with these HRs to say, is this Andrew Warner and this Andy Warner the same thing? If so, tie our patient ID to these records and we can merge them into one giant. And I think you have all these data aggregates that exist out there for being able to push data out there and say, here's all my patient information. And it's almost like a highway, right, for patients that exist in the world. And which is one thing the CARES Act has been nice about, is like openness of all this data so that we can have an actual great patient experience, to where if I'm on vacation in Florida for some odd reason that I have to go to the hospital, they can type in my information and it pulls up my health history, which is amazing. But that's what these tools help with, right? Like these different services. And that's what we've been trying to use, is how do we tie those? Easy in some aspects and harder in others, to where once you get into the space of, children and some of those different, minors, to somebody to where those parent records, patient records tie together. It's sometimes quite difficult to tie those together when the parent is the one facilitating, like coming in for service and saying, I have a child.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, that's really something I haven't even considered. As someone who doesn't have children, that's something that I take for granted. Like I'm in control of my data, but to be in control of a minor's data as well. I think the other piece that you're probably familiar with, at least from my experience when I worked in this space, was just the amount of data agreements with different partners that you had to go through and understanding what your valid use cases were under those agreements and what you were allowed to use that data for. Were there ways you could obfuscate certain information to make it more general, to get a population of patients that you could not identify back, just to get you a little bit more sort of research potential? That blew my mind because there's such specific granularities. And I think for anyone entering data product space in healthcare, I'd love if you could just really quickly talk about like the different types of contracts that you might get and form with these other data aggregators or these EHR systems, and kind of what the restrictions are. And then potentially, are there ways to work around some of those restrictions, or are there ways you can go back to those partners and potentially negotiate what those agreements are to give you a little bit more commercial use rights for their data?
Yeah. So the first piece of this whole puzzle starts with the patient. Right. In your agreement with the patient, in what you have the ability to do with their consent. And, some of us don't read any of those terms of service or consents or any of those different things, but it's right. Like how many social media things have we signed up for and said, let's sell our data to Google? It's just, but the problems with some of this patient data or the information from a patient is, with these startups, we're trying to get people in as fast as possible. So that first terms of service made 6 months ago isn't the same as it is today. So you really have to point in time the terms of service in what those consents are that you ask these patients for, and seeing what did you even agree for your patients? So that's where you really have to start. And as an example, we didn't have this ability to go back to our patients and say, hey, we have X that's available for you with this data partner, which is what they require, this data partner to require us to have a consent to reach out to that patient if a drug worked for them or clinical trial worked for them. So you first start with your patient, and then you move into this. If you're trying to use a data aggregator, PHI is a huge thing. So you can't actually look for a patient, in quotes, without the correct use case on your side. As an example, if you're looking for clinical trials, since we've kind of gone down this path of clinical trials, you have to have essentially the evidence, right? It's almost like bringing something to the court and say, will you indict this person? It's like, well, what evidence do you have to say that this is your correct use case to go actually get their health history? And so that first agreement is with the patient. The second one with these data aggregators is more case-by-case basis. And this is where having a good general counsel on staff of saying, what can we actually do with our information with this, and what are our correct use cases, so that you as a product manager, you feel safe writing that query or working with your APIs to correct data. Because in general, we're not lawyers. Some of us may, but the legal aspect of all of this healthcare data is a PHI leak or incorrect usage of data can ruin your organization, right? Especially if it's in an infancy phase.
I mean, look at what just happened with Snowflake in the past couple of weeks. There's a lot of people still investigating like just how big of a leak that was. So, okay. Yeah.
So in general, our information is out there in the world. We know that just because we know it's been a billion times, but we still have to abide by these laws that do exist out there for this health. The work.
Yeah. What I think starting at the data capture with the patient, I think is really a key thing. Something that I learned from Cassie Kozakov, who's spoke at the Data Connect conference last year. She's the former I forget her specific title, but she used to be head of data at Google. And one of the things she really talked about is just how messy data capture is. And when talking about data quality, if you aren't focused on data capture and your data quality exercises, you're already behind the curve, because if you can capture your data correctly the first time, it's less cleanup on the back end in your tables to like transform into like clear and nice tables from your raw data, which I thought was really interesting. And then from there, once you have it all cleaned up, some semblance, how do you use it? But I do want to shift though, is like, so we've talked a little bit about gathering the data, what kind of data exists and what kind of use cases it's for, and who's interested in buying it, the different sort of use cases. I'm curious though, from the product side then, is like, how do you actually price and sell it? What is that even, where do you even start? Because I'm someone who's worked almost exclusively on internal products and have not had a lot of experience having to go and price something, figure it out. Or if I had an entire pricing team supporting me at these large corporations. And so I'm curious, as someone who's worked in a lot of smaller firms, how have you figured this out? Because to me, it's a big black box.
Well, it's always a big black box until you know what you have, right? It is.
Yeah.
So price and value is always into who's purchasing, right? It's always on the consumer side, customer, what's the perceived value? And it depends to the granularity of data that you're trying to sell. Are you selling de-identified data that's a large population set or a specific use case, or is it very broad for research? So you have to go into this little market adventure, I'd say, for a lack of better words, right? Like of just taking those identified customers or possible customers that exist out there, doing user research, almost user research, like, right, doing that market research, talking to them and saying, what's a patient worth to you? They could say, oh, it's $50,000, or it'll speed up our clinical trial by X%. So you have to go into a little bit of analysis on the back end, say clinical trial takes 2 years, but you're cutting 25% off the time because recruitment takes, a quarter of that time to get somebody in. This drug's ultimately worth $2 million. So you're going through that analysis to say, we probably save them, we don't have any actual real numbers here, but like $50,000.
Yeah.
So say I price it at 25. You ask them, like, if I get you this patient and they sign up, is it worth 25 grand to you? And if they bite too early on it and don't say no, pricing your.
Oh, yeah.
So
that's how I always feel in salary negotiation.
Always. You're like, dang it.
Yeah, I know, right? I think that's anytime you're in the market of selling, whether it's, something to as a product or selling like your worth as a, anytime someone just immediately says, yeah, sold. It's like, dang it, we asked for too little. I guess I'm curious though, like, that's one equation, but then you have to really look at who else has this data, what kind of competitive analysis. And so I guess from the thought of healthcare data, what does that look like? Because a lot of people are pretty secretive about pricing. And so how do you actually get into the weeds and understand what's my price against my competitors and what's my data worth against my competitors, evaluating the data that you have against what they have? Like, that feels to me very hard.
It is. So it's a great point, right? Like, say there are other companies, you can even partner with those other companies that have similar or like they have an extra piece, right? Like they somehow got an extra piece of that data. So you start this is one tack, right? Is working together to come together with your full data set of saying, here's our information. Or you just do hit the ground pavement working with BD and the business development side of things and saying, who are you currently working? So that you can just understand the marketplace. Google's a great place to look for this information, using some of the chat GPTs of the world to say, I'm trying to sell this data. What other companies exist out there that sell this same data? And you might actually get some information on that pricing. This is where you start using some of your partners or like your board in the past, not here, some previous companies to go and play the role of purchaser and like of saying, of working with that other company to say, hey, I would like to purchase X data or these types of patients for this type of thing. And you start to get pricing. So it's some of the backwoods of like, how do I pull this information out of somebody? And it's okay, right? Like we all do it. We all try to find what that price is, but at the end of the day, is it going to be the main driver for your business? So is this going to be the main revenue generating model that you have going forward? Or is this a nice add-on to where you can play with the pricing a little bit more to start somewhere low? Can you undercut the market like a Slack or some of those other ones, right? Coming in and saying, we'll just give it to you.
Right.
But put us on your website.
Yeah. Always a good way to get some early marketing. And, I think, once you then have done your research and you understand who your customer is, you understand sort of what your competitors are, then you have to actually build your data product. And so then it becomes a question of what actually is the product that I'm selling? Is it an individual record for an individual patient? Is it a community of patients or a universe of patients that match? Like, I guess, how do you determine what the actual product is from all your data based with all of your market research from your competitors and your consumers? How then do you package that up to actually sell as a product to that consumer that you've identified? Like, what are the pieces that they want? And how granular do you get? Is it like bundles of data? Is it an individual patient record? I'm assuming, like all things, it depends.
Well, it always depends. Is it an API, right? Like, are you in? So it depends on the level of internal capacity that you have and in what you're looking to do. Is this something that you're doing the last mile, connecting back to the patient for whatever it is, for going back to the trial side of things? Or is it pop health where people are just trying to understand as an analytics product? So depends internally how much time and investment you want to give into it right away. Do you have how clean is your data, which we can go into that, how to clean this up into a way that's actually usable. But so first, that's kind of where you start, is like, what does it look like internally? Can you add an API to this? Can you put a front end on this for somebody else to use it? Which also goes back to your pricing, right? If you're putting a front end onto it, it's software as a service at that for somebody. So you can probably price it a little bit more competitively to where it's just a front end somebody goes to, they write a query, pull in the info. That's one side of things. Is it an API that people are going to have certain limits, certain information? Go in the Open API or OpenAI side of things is, it's $20 for a person to go in and use it. But if you want the API access on an enterprise level, that's where we're going to get you, because you have the ability to essentially do whatever you. So I guess use case by use case. It depends.
Yeah. But I think for anyone entering the space, that's helpful to consider. Because I've seen, entire marketplaces of data, specifically centered around healthcare, that have been created. I've seen individual patient records sold for like hundreds of dollars because it's that complete and has that good of quality. I think that's really important, though, because if you think about healthcare data, you get the quality wrong, then your outcome of whatever the product that you're selling for, whether it's a research study, a longitudinal patient study, all of those pieces are then like that less reliable. And when you're talking about healthcare, you're really impacting people's lives. And so you brought it up. So let's talk about it. Cleaning up your data. And I think this is really important when working with data engineers specifically, and getting them into the mindset of like, what is the product that we're building and why does it matter? I am sure you've got lots of experience on, one, just understanding what clean data means in this context, and two, trying to get engineers who often just don't think in product terms. They're not trained for product terms and thinking, and that's not an indictment on them. It is. But generally you get them started and then they get really fascinated with it. So I'm curious from both angles, what are the important aspects of cleaning up this kind of data and how hard it is? Infinitely hard. And then like, how do you get your engineers to also get on board with this sort of like I think a lot of people would view questionable of selling like healthcare data because we just don't understand the regulatory scrutiny behind it and whatnot. So that's my experience anyway. So yeah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so cleaning up data, and putting it, I guess the biggest piece with this whole thing is there a standard format out there? You mentioned FHIR earlier, something which, in some of the research that we've done that's makes people comfortable, right? Like, so it's understanding, are there actual regulated data sets, or is there a format that everything should be in that is generally accepted, right? And because everybody thinks their data set is special and its format is special in its own right. But at the end of the day, the customer wants it in a certain format so that they can into their system, merge the records or do whatever they don't want to do work on their side of things, right? You're selling it, right? You're selling this data as something that's usable. So get it into a data format that's parsed down. So FHIR is a great example in the healthcare space. If you're doing the one-to-one patient matching or selling actual patient. So you're then taking your, could be 16,000 different tables of data or however many, right? Just using large amount of tables or table structures because something was hacked together for growth. Happens everywhere.
Yeah, everywhere.
And then you end up working through this process with your data engineers to say, how do I move these records and kind of merge them in together into one? Are there common data types or that, like, as an example, ICD codes are huge in the healthcare space because it's how we build things. It's how we know who has been diagnosed with whatever, going down that path. Well, if it's coming from an actual database with somebody entering it in the system is picking from a dropdown, as an example, right? Standardized, it's the same way, but you could have a free-form text field for the same thing for some of these ICD codes, and somebody types in a lowercase letter, or they don't put the dot in, or they have an extra space in there. So you have to go through this process of, what does the current data set look like? Is it standardized in its own right? If it's not, you have to go through that process of saying, here's this data. This is where some of the gen models actually work really, really well, of saying, here's this record, standardize it to this format and pull it down, and then update that table with that correct information. So you have to first get your data standardized across whatever you're going to merge into one. Then you go through let's create the middleware product that's going to run this job, essentially, to update the records, pull the records in the new format, and put it into its own data store that's non-operational. Because I think that's something else, is you have this operational data store, have this analytics data store, then you have this new product, right? This new product needs to have it, de-identified for PHI reasons, or it's just the information that they're going to use and not the entire patient record, because that gets into our past 20 minutes ago or so, where you're saying, well, what do I have access to? What's that agreement that I have with this patient? What is this agreement that I have with this partner? So you have to shrink that data set while keeping the integrity of everything together and moving it into one new place for everybody to use. Data engineers, on the other hand, working with them, it's getting them in the conversation with the rest of the business, with the customer. It's the general product thing that some people lack, or it's harder for some people to do, like get the engineer in the room, have them understand the business value, what it means, and get them excited about the end of the day, what this means for the patient, or what this data is going to do for the customer. Get them excited. I know it's sometimes hard to do, getting people excited about selling data, because it's not a sexy front-end UI product, right? It's
right. And I think people are really apprehensive about selling healthcare data, because there's sort of this, I think, from social media and what we've seen with the damages of selling personal data from social media and the harms that we have demonstrably seen come from that. There's some level of like what harm might be imposed upon the greater the whole if we start selling healthcare data and making it even more accessible to like commercialization and consumerism. And those are all valid concerns. I really like, though, the fact that you want to bring engineers. And I think every single product that I've ever worked on in every single industry, getting engineers a sense of the business and not just telling them this is what we need to build, but like getting them involved in determining what's the right thing to build, helping them really codify and help understand the problem space that we're trying to solve for and what our consumers are really after. I can't recommend for any product manager in any industry how important that is. And particularly with data, I think we often think about, well, the data just feeds in all of these other products on the front end. But like when your product is the data, that conversation is so much more critical to your data and your transform engineers and all of these different folks who are really invested. And I actually think that there's probably, and I haven't really thought too much about this, I'm just speaking off the fly at this point, but like there's probably some sort of data user experience role that we haven't really created yet because it's so esoteric at this point to figure out like, how do we design data to be consumable by any user that we've done research on? Because I'm not a UX researcher. Our engineers aren't typically UX researchers. And so I think like that's probably something that, just speaking off the cuff here, that I'm really interested in potentially exploring. And then, you talked about, these different standards, but I think there's so many different standards on how we transfer and store healthcare data. Again, we talked about FHIR, but there's HL7, there's all those ICD codes, there's X12 data structures, and there's not a one size fits all model. It is use case specific. I am curious though, since you brought up ICD codes, do you have a favorite?
Yeah,
we all know, for those who don't know, there's a lot of weird ones.
There was one I saw the other day, and it has to do with like a rat bite poisoning that like you get from somebody. I can't remember the ICD for it. It's going to frustrate me that I don't.
Yeah. I mean, there's ones that are like sucked into a jet engine and it was a subsequent encounter. What? Yeah. So if for those in the audience who don't know what we're talking about, just search absurd ICD-10 codes, just the letters ICD-10, and you'll find like a myriad of weird things that like are actual healthcare data records that are put into patients' data for your own amusement. There's a lot of weird ones in there. Some of them are pretty catastrophic and horrific, and some are a little bit like stranger. But there's a lot of them out there.
Okay, the bitten by rat, the initial encounter is W53.11XA. Like in for everybody else, right? Like these ICD codes are what the insurance companies use to bill, and that's where the pricing for their side of things comes from. It's a world in its own right.
Ugh. We haven't even discussed the insurance industry and this healthcare data. I'm sure we could go down a lot of rabbit holes and probably have a lot of agreement and alignment on just a lot of different discussions on that aspect, because I think there is probably a lot more problematic instances because of the nature of, at least in the States, privatized healthcare. But that's neither here or there. That's more of a value thing. But
I did want to add the user experience side of things.
Yeah,
I've actually worked with a couple data engineers that, the business wants this beautiful thing and thinks they want it displayed in a certain way. These data engineers actually understand how it should be interpreted as well. Like some of them do, right? Some of them are just specific ones and zeros, but others have this other piece to them, almost that analytics side of things, to say, this is what this representation means, and this is how it should be interpreted, and how it's easy for somebody in the business to use. So I think like leaning into your data engineers throughout this process is something that you should definitely do. And it's the same thing for building a platform, right? Lean into your architects, lean into them so hard that they are the ones that are coming up with this new thing. You're helping lead them down the path of getting it implemented. But at the end of the day, it's taking the vision of how they think this should work, putting it into action and putting it in business terms so that you can say, we have to invest X dollars to get this outcome. Because back-end work, just in general, moving your data around, all these things, doesn't inherently say, oh, this is a value add. We're actually going to get some money out of this. Like, we're going to make some money. It's a time sink. It's a time sink getting it there. It's a money sink to get it there. It's that's, I'd say, probably the hardest part about trying to develop a data product is like getting the value on the actual work that happened prior to actually selling it.
Yeah, I think that's the last probably really good question is like, okay, so you've done all this market research. You've got the sort of product that you want to build for. There's probably some level of experiments that you have to run to validate all of your assumptions that you've made and all of the evidence that you've collected to make certain that you are in the right place. But then the big question, particularly for a large firm that doesn't specialize in building data products versus a small firm like that is their niche. They are really focused on building out a data product. Funding that effort at a large firm looks much different because it's usually like a side, an addition to their core experience and product. I worked at a large logistics firm that shipped pharmaceutical and medical supplies across the country. And they really couldn't crack this code because part of their funding model was just kind of broken. And I'm curious from your experience, obviously you're working for a firm that specifically specializes in healthcare data, but have you had to go and still fight for funding even there to like make certain that the product is like supported?
Yeah. So we went through this MVP process at first just to say, what can we actually do with this information and this data? And it was like, cool, we can pull it out. It's sellable. It's worth this X dollars. So then it's actually scoping, let's say, another MVP of what this whole thing means, right? So do we have to actually fix something? So scoping out what it takes to fix, identifying that timeline and the cost associated to it. Are we going to be using something that's off the shelf to do this work? What's the cost of that? And then wrapping all of this together of saying, by doing this, we project that we'll have X revenue by X amount of patients that we're selling to these partners this year, say $1 million. It's going to cost us $2 million to get there. So we need $2 million. We'll make that back up in 2 years. Is this something that we're going to have this long-term investment for? Or is this just a one-time data cell that we're just going to essentially have a data engineer pull all the data, de-identify it, ship it? So it really depends what's that long-term plan for the business so that you can then insert yourself as saying, this could be your next revenue generating arm. While you're going to have to sink, $2-3 million into it, your return is going to be X, and this is your runway to get. But also don't build something that's bulletproof off the bat, right? Like it has to be something that's off the ground, adapt and move. So identify that little MVP, that dirty little word that we product managers love to throw around is like, just build the MVP. And then it's like the MVPs have been alive for 6 years. Nobody.
Yeah. And you're like, we still have to fortify it. So many companies will just build an MVP and then be like, all right, we're done, and move on to the next shiny thing versus like fortifying it. Oh, it's a scourge. I find that happens a lot more in like large corporations, small ones, because small ones are just more focused, more refined. But if I could shape senior leaders at corporations and be like, focus, stop getting distracted by the next shiny thing. You've committed to something. And I think that's really important in product, is like a focus and a commitment, or kill it. Like if you're not going to be dedicated to funding long-term the support of a product, which is not done. And I think that's one of the confusions that I think a legacy model of product management in large corporations specifically use, like, once I've shipped it, it's done, and I don't have to continue funding this outside of keep the lights on. But no, there's like really specific improvements that you're going to consistently need to make. There's going to be new features and capabilities you want to launch. And I think like that, we probably don't have enough time to get into it, but like for data product, there's probably going to be new assets of data that's going to come in, or new sort of types of data that we may not have had access to. I think like one of the biggest indicators is like the socioeconomic indicators of health, and how do you tie that into an EHR record? Social media data, is there value there that pulls into what someone's healthcare sort of outcomes are? I would presume probably yes, because people are so willing to share so much about their lives in social media that there's probably a lot we could glean. And I don't even know where we would start to get there, but I think from that aspect of like making certain you're highly focused, you're committed, and that everyone's kind of on board is like, okay, this is a bet we're making. We've run the experiments. We've got some early term success. And then being willing to kill things when they do fail, rather than be like, well, we've sunk $1 million. We just need to sink another $500,000 to $2 million into it to make it work. Like, no, sometimes it's just like, we have to go back and being okay, versus doubling down. That's a really delicate balance. I asked this last question of all of my guests, but I'm really interested from your perspective, as I am with anyone, is like, what's a big mistake you've made in your career around data products and data product management, and what you learned from it that you've carried forward in future roles, or what you hope to, if you've made mistakes recently, that you're hoping to like, I learned this really great lesson. Let me carry this forward, as I continue in this work.
Yeah, I'd say my biggest piece in healthcare, especially in healthcare data products, is actually putting more of an emphasis on the patient side of things and vouching for them. I'd say some of the things, it's more of an ethical piece than anything. So, just piling stuff together and then doing something for the business versus thinking about what the actual impact is on the patient. And that's something that we all should probably try to vie a little bit more for, especially in healthcare, is vouching for our patient, vouching for the user for other data products, right? The actual person, humanizing them a little bit more, and what their data actually is in what it means to them, so that it's clear, it's concise, so that when we ship this data product, they're not getting incorrectly classified into a category or diagnosis that could ultimately impact them and their families in the long term. I've made the mistakes of just like, all right, yeah, this kind of looks good, right? It's QC and everything a little bit more, right? It's taken that extra 5 minutes or extra, that extra time to dive deeper and QC yourself a little bit more in the data that you're about to ship, because it means something to that patient at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think a lot of, I'll share this, and I'm probably going to butcher the quote, but for folks who don't know, I love Threads, the meta version of Twitter. But the CEO of Asana had a really interesting quote when he was talking about sort of like all the drama that's gone on with OpenAI. But one of the things he said, and I think what you're specifically citing, is like a lot of companies, especially startups, are working to solve these really thorny problems, particularly within the healthcare space, is they really want to do meaningful, beneficial work for everyone, while also making money for it, because that's our model. And one of the things he said is, even the best intentions cannot survive a touch with this economy. And I think that kind of concept of like putting patients first and approaching business with a really sense of strong ethics and not just the end of day profit is something that I think more of us need to really take a lot more seriously, because there is a certain truth to what he said, is that like the economy is so ripe for efficiency and extraction of capital at all expenses that sometimes it loses sight of that. And it really takes a lot of diligent eyes and strong convictions to maintain that. So thank you for sharing that, because I think we all could be reminded of it. That said, I want to thank you so much for spending, a little over 45 minutes with me this morning. We're definitely going to have to get coffee at some point, since we live so close to one another. But, I want to thank you very much. I want to give a shout out to the Data as a Product podcast network and Scott Hirleman for giving me the opportunity to host this podcast, our sponsor, Soda, and then our fantastic editor, LaConya Butler, who helps to make certain that all of these episodes get pushed out to you for listening. So again, I'm Michael Toland, one of your hosts for the Data Product Management in Action podcast. Shout out to you, Andrew Warner. Thank you so much for being a guest today. Enjoy.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for listening. Hopefully you got some great actionable insights out of this episode. We're so excited to dig deeper into data product management and its many facets. If you want to engage more with the show, you can follow us on LinkedIn and check out Soda's website at soda.io for more related content around product management in data. And if you are a practitioner bringing product management practices to data and want to potentially be a guest, please check the show notes for a link to apply. And as always, we strongly encourage people from underrepresented groups in tech to apply. Much as I'm a handsome devil, we don't want all our guests only looking like me. So again, let's get excited for more digging into data product management in action.